We've all had enough of COVID-19. Enough fear, mourning, and disruption. We want to move on. We want to talk about something else, think about something else, and put this behind us. And we will get through it, but not without being profoundly changed by it. More than a year and over 2.7 million deaths later, resilience has become a sort of mantra that we all want to see turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Despite COVID shining a light on the ugly realities of socioeconomic, environmental, gender, and racial inequalities, the politics of scapegoating, and the fragility of open borders, we long for some positive outcome, learned lessons, and a renewed sense of solidarity. But in order to get there, hope is not enough. What we need is lucidity, a clear understanding of what can be uncomfortable truths. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. As scientists were making remarkably fast strides toward the development of vaccines these last several months, researchers in the humanities and social sciences began taking stock of the human impact of the pandemic beyond the ICU. From economic recovery plans and COVID diplomacy to changes in socialization and screen fatigue, scientific research is key to helping us understand what that impact is. In some of my own research, I have studied human emotions and how those emotions impact political opinions and decisions. Emotions are an essential connector between our bodies and our minds, between what we feel and what we think. During a pandemic and in its aftermath, I would argue that we should be particularly attentive to the political repercussions of emotions. The fear of sickness, the suffering of loss, the isolation experienced due to lockdowns and curfews, cancellations and closings, the disgust felt at the thought of being in contact with the virus, the anger and indignation caused by its rampant spread and exacerbated impact on vulnerable populations. A pandemic is a recipe for a potent cocktail of heightened emotions. And each of those emotions can directly impact political outcomes. Emotions have been an important theme in moral philosophy since antiquity. And it is precisely this complex connection between reasoning, moral judgment, and emotional experience that makes emotions so relevant to politics. Think about the political importance of persuading others of our opinions in democracies. Healthy democratic political systems rely on the capacity to persuade one's fellow citizens rather than to use force against them. In his study of rhetoric in the 4th century BCE, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle identified 3 means by which the art of persuasion operates: ethos, pathos, and logos. That is to say, moral character, emotion, and reason. This suggests that our capacity to analyze the rational validity of arguments is connected to a judgment about the moral character of the person who is trying to persuade us and to the emotional resonance of those arguments. Contemporary neuroscience has been able to better understand those connections within the human brain. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has extensively studied the connections between emotions and decision-making processes. His work emphasizes the feedback loop between judgment and responses, both physical and mental. Damasio defines an emotion as, quote, the combination of a mental evaluative process with dispositional responses to that process, mostly toward the body proper, resulting in an emotional body state, but also toward the brain itself, resulting in additional mental changes, end quote. So emotions rely on some form of judgment or evaluation, while at the same time reinforcing those judgments. Emotions are contextual. They rely on cues from the context, for example, to measure the degree of danger present or to assign blame. For example, our emotional reaction to an injured person is not the same if we believe that person has been the victim of an accident versus the victim of an intentional assault. In the first case, we will feel compassion and sadness. In the second case, we will also experience anger and indignation. Both emotional experiences are painful, but while the first tends to reinforce a sense of powerlessness, accidents happen, the second favors a desire to act in response to the perceived injustice. Indeed, painful emotions can sometimes reinforce the desire to help victims and contribute to the community. They can even lead to political vocations. Alain Faure, a French political scientist and specialist of emotions, has found in his research about local-level politicians in France, Italy, and Japan that the experience of painful or traumatic events is at the root of why some people choose politics as a profession. In response to the suffering of loss or injustice experienced as a child or young adult, many local elected officials experience their political vocation as a means of reparation of a painful past. But negative emotions such as fear or anger do not always lead to increased empathy or solidarity. They can also lead to hostility, resentment, or hatred. When human beings feel threatened or endangered, a multitude of reactions are set off. And it is only by consciously and rationally thinking through those reactions that the most dangerous of them can be avoided. If we don't make that effort to reflect on our own emotions, on the ways that our dispositional responses can impact what we think, or can be made to think by those who have an interest in manipulating our political opinions, then we're actually failing to protect something very precious: our capacity to think critically about ourselves. We can get valuable insight into potentially problematic emotional responses by studying the socio-moral emotions. These are emotions such as guilt, empathy, or indignation that rely on moral judgments about ourselves and others, and are informed by ideas about what and who is socially acceptable. They are also considered to be second-order emotions with respect to primary emotions such as happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, or surprise, in relation to which they represent a form of meta-reflection. For example, my reflection about my sadness because of a friend's sickness produces a feeling of empathy in me toward him and his family. Or, upon seeing the bloodied body of an injured pedestrian, a bystander experiences a core disgust response, an instinctual physical reaction of revulsion. But perceiving that the person was a victim of a hit-and-run accident, she experiences a sense of moral indignation, and her anger is directed at the wrongdoer. It turns out that the relationship between our involuntary physiological reactions of revulsion and our often politicized, reflective emotions, such as anger at injustice, can be a causal one. The political theory and social psychology literatures suggest that primary emotions, such as disgust, can influence political opinions. A number of experimental studies have indicated the existence of a causal relationship between the degree of sensitivity a person has to core disgust responses and certain political opinions, for example, regarding the rights of sexual minorities. In her work on sexual orientation and constitutional law, Martha Nussbaum also reminds us that associating disgusting properties with certain groups has long been a political strategy for marginalizing those groups, such as Dalits, Jews, persons of color, or women. Studies carried out by cognitive neuroscientists have confirmed the interconnections between the primary and socio-moral emotions. For example, core disgust responses and the moral emotion of indignation have been shown to stimulate overlapping regions of the brain. But this correlation does not in itself determine the behavior that these emotional responses will produce. An ongoing process of socialization, including exposure to political rhetoric and media coverage, contributes to how we view others and the actions we are willing to take on their behalf. In 2007, psychologists Lazana Harris and Susan Fisk published the results of a study of the brain's reactions as subjects viewed images of individuals from a variety of social groups. The study showed that viewing images of members of social outgroups, such as homeless persons or drug addicts, elicited a core disgust reaction. That reaction in turn negatively influenced the subject's capacity to attribute human characteristics to the members of the social outgroup, such as an individual personality and preferences, or the capacity to experience socio-moral emotions. So, let's again imagine that situation of being faced with a bloodied victim of a hit-and-run collision. The literature suggests that a bystander's propensity to help that person will depend on the social group to which the person is perceived as belonging. A greater social proximity will tend to increase a compassionate response, whereas a greater social distance will tend to favor a disgust response. And herein lies the moral ambiguity of reflexive emotions, such as indignation. A feeling of justified anger can motivate citizens to stand up against injustice, to put the collective good above individual interest, to take risks to defend the vulnerable and the innocent. And at the same time, moral indignation can also be directed against people that are viewed as morally deviant, as outsiders, as foreigners, as sources of pollution, corruption, or disease. In the hands of populist politicians, moral indignation is a powerful tool for designating scapegoats and reinforcing distinctions between the quote-unquote true people and intruders. So it's by becoming aware of the vastly different potentialities of our emotions that we remain in control of the behaviors which our emotions elicit. In a climate of generalized anxiety, such as during a pandemic, the brain's surveillance system is on high alert, ready to react to signs of threat or intrusion. Here again, however, if our primary reactions can be difficult to control, the formation of our political opinions and behaviors are ours to determine. Indeed, George Marcus's work on emotions and democratic politics and the vast literature it inspired suggest that an emotional climate of anxiety actually opens a window of opportunity for reflection about which action to take and which objectives to pursue. And as the political science literature suggests, emotions of anxiety can produce a reflective type of citizenship, one that is open to considering other viewpoints and finding compromises. Whereas emotions of aversion and anger favor a conflictual approach to political disagreements with others. Some of the recent research into the pandemic's repercussions on emotions highlights the need to become aware of our emotional responses and the impact they can have on our political and social behaviors. While we pine for a return to normal social interactions, confinement might actually be reducing our capacity to engage in healthy social interactions by reducing our exposure to our fellow human beings. A team of psychologists from the University of Valencia have studied the capacity to recognize emotions based on facial expressions in a group of young adults before confinement and during confinement. The results indicate a decreased capacity to recognize facial expressions of happiness and an increased capacity to recognize expressions of sadness. These early findings concerning the impact of the pandemic on socio-emotional intelligence should alert us to a form of social vulnerability that is likely to be on the rise in our post-COVID societies. This makes studies about the link between emotions and citizenship, the interpersonal and the political, all the more pertinent. We know that feelings of social isolation and exclusion cause pain that is as real as physical pain. Being lucid about the differing potentialities of those painful emotions, either more aggressiveness or increased empathy, either reinforced resentment or strengthened civic mindedness is an important step toward turning this pandemic together into a positive opportunity. Thank you.